Good evening, everyone. My name is Nicole Milano, and I want to thank you all for joining us both in person and online for tonight's lecture with Dr. Ayah Nuriddin. We welcome participation from all attendees in our question and answer session following the talk. For attendees online, you'll find a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can enter a question, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of the lecture. Online attendees should also know that closed captioning is currently enabled if you have the updated version of Zoom. You can find an option at the bottom of your screen to turn the captioning on or off during tonight's lecture. The Heberden Society is a history of medicine lecture series held at Weill Cornell since 1975, and I would like to thank the Office of the Dean for continuing to support the series. I'm excited to share that we have 2 additional lectures this academic year. Our next lecture will be with Jeremy Brown, who will be sharing insights from his most recent book on the Jewish pandemic experience on March 19th at 5 p.m. Finally, on April 17th, 2024 at 1 p.m., note the change in time, Beatrix Hoffman will share the impact current and past immigration policies have had on immigrant health outcomes. I will be sending out more information about these lectures following tonight's presentations. All lectures are free, hybrid, and open to the public, so please join. Now, for those who are interested in the history of the New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center, I would like to invite you to conduct research in our very own medical center archives. The archives includes materials dating to 1771 and includes this photograph of the hospital's nutrition department preparing some turkeys for Thanksgiving in 1961. The chefs roasted 72 22-pound turkeys in order to serve 1,300 patients and hospital staff on duty that day. The hospital bakers also made 66 dozen dinner rolls and 110 pumpkin pies to go along with the turkey. So none of us can complain about our own Thanksgiving meals and how difficult they are. Now you can find digitized documents and more than 14,000 photographs like this one online through the link seen here. Many more are available through on-site research appointments, which we're very happy to coordinate for those who are interested. I would now like to introduce Arlene Shaner, who will say a few words about the New York Academy of Medicine, the co-sponsor of tonight's lecture. Welcome, Arlene.
Thank you, Nicole. The New York Academy of Medicine's library has been co-sponsoring one Heberden lecture each season for many years now. And I am especially pleased that we are the co-sponsors for this particular lecture because I have known Ayah since she was a graduate student and was using our library. For those of you who might not be familiar with NIAM, we are a 176-year-old organization committed to tackling the barriers that prevent everyone from living a healthy life by generating knowledge, changing systems, and engaging the public. Next slide, please. The library is open to everyone by appointment and is one of the most significant history of medicine and public health collections in the country. So if you have research interests that are connected to us, please make an appointment and come and visit. I would love to have you. And now I am going to introduce Heberden Society medical student Elizabeth Gussid, who will introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. For those of you who I have not met before, my name is Elizabeth Gussid. I'm the student representative for Heberden, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ayah Nuriddin today. Today, she will be presenting her lecture, Seed and Soil, Black Eugenic Thought in the 19th and 20th Centuries. Dr. Nuriddin received her BA in International Relations and History from American University, and then her MA in International Relations and History from American University, and then her MA in History and an MLS from the University of Maryland, as well as her PhD in the History of Medicine from Johns Hopkins University. Currently, she is a lecturer in the Council of Humanities and African American Studies at Princeton University, where she's been working on her book, also based on this lecture, Seed and Soil, Black Eugenic Thought in the 19th and 20th Centuries. Her research aims to explore how African Americans navigated questions of racial science, eugenics, and hereditarianism in relation to struggles for racial justice during the 19th and 20th centuries. Her research has been published in Historical Studies of Natural Science, the Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Sciences, and The Lancet. She has also appeared on the Disability History Association podcast and American History TV on C-SPAN. With all that said, again, it's my pleasure to introduce this amazing lecture coming up.
Thanks so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here today and excited to share my work with you all. This is from my forthcoming but embryonic manuscript entitled Seed and Soil. So I look forward to your comments and questions. I want to begin my talk today with a figure that I encountered when I first started researching African Americans and eugenics back when I was an undergrad. Her name is Thelma Burlack Boozer. She was born in Ocala, Florida in 1906 and moved to New York as a child. She graduated as valedictorian of her class of Theodore Roosevelt High School in 1924. She later graduated cum laude from NYU with a bachelor's in commercial science and a master's in journalism in 1931. Boozer was also an active member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha, or AKA sorority, which is one of the Divine Nine of African-American Greek life. She wrote for African-American newspapers like the New York Amsterdam News and the Pittsburgh Courier, as well as for the New York Age and the Labor Vanguard. She also did public relations work for Harlem Hospital and the Alumni Division of the United Negro College Fund. So you might be wondering what she's doing in a presentation about eugenics. She, under the pen name TEB, she had a regular column in the New York Amsterdam News called The Feminist Viewpoint. In one of these columns in 1934, she published a piece called Birth Control Gains Sanction, which discussed eugenics and racial improvement. TEB wrote that, quote, "We need compulsory sterilization of the mentally and physically unfit. 2, we should welcome birth control as a national measure." She also argued in the piece, quote, "More well-born babies, fewer ill-born babies, and sterilization of those too unfit to become parents will aid society in solving some of its major problems," end quote. Boozer is part of a substantial group of African-American physicians, scientists, scholars, and activists in the early 20th century that embraced the possibilities of eugenics for improving African-American life. My manuscript, Seed and Soil, argues that African-Americans have a separate but sort of adjacent form of eugenic thinking that I broadly describe as Black eugenics. And I argue that Black eugenics is essential for sort of having a full and complete history of American eugenics. Black eugenics was a hereditarian approach to racial uplift that emphasized social reform, reproductive control, and public health as strategies of biological racial improvement. It was part of a longer history of Black engagement with racial science that stretches back to the 19th century and continues to shape the ways that Black people talk about race after the Second World War. African-American physicians, scientists, and intellectuals embraced notions of fit and unfit, and even advocated for eugenic measures like compulsory sterilization. The fundamental difference between their work and the work of white eugenicists was that African-Americans didn't sort of cast these divisions along racial lines. Whereas white eugenicists often argued that Black people were an unfit race among other inferior and unfit races, African-American eugenicists sort of argued that there were unfit members of each race and that eugenic measures would eliminate the unfit within racial groups and therefore improve their biological composition. So African Americans were actually participants in the larger American eugenics movement, even though many of the movement's sort of white architects would have considered them inferior and unfit. They read and reviewed its most important works and corresponded with its leaders. And when segregation was not an obstacle, they even attended its conferences. Booker T. Washington of the Tuskegee Institute, who's arguably one of the most important African-American educators and reformers of the 20th century, corresponded with Charles Davenport of the Eugenics Record Office and even invited him to visit. This invitation is renewed by Washington's successor, Robert Russamoten, who invited him to come and take anthropometric measurements of Tuskegee students as part of Davenport's study on race crossing with physical anthropologist Morris Stegerda. So as you can see in the image on your right, that there's a specific emphasis here on studying Negro white crosses because they're interested in sort of taking these measurements to figure out where exactly racial mixing sort of appears in physical form. Monroe Work, also of the Tuskegee Institute, was a sociologist who worked with Washington to establish National Negro Health Week, exhibited his major work, the Negro Yearbook, at the Second International Eugenics Congress in 1921. Howard University botanist Thomas Wyatt Turner assigned Paul Popenoe and Roswell Johnson's famous text, Applied Eugenics, and Davenport's essay, Euthenics and Eugenics, as part of his courses on sex, hygiene, and biology and education. And I could, of course, keep going with all of these different examples, but I want to sort of emphasize the ways that not only are Black people sort of within the movement, but they're creating their own terms sort of beyond the parameters of the movement at the same time. So not only are they participating in this larger movement, but they use eugenic thought and racial science to challenge the scientific racism that's built into eugenics and racial science. And while that sounds paradoxical, the actors I write about imagine that they can distinguish biological race as a category from the existence of racism. They sought to undermine the scientific premise for structural racism by reinterpreting eugenics and racial science. And to be clear, African-American engagements and reinterpretations of eugenics were certainly problematic and were often scientistic, ableist, classist, and colorist. Even as they imagined liberatory possibilities, they still became involved in the sort of problematics of eugenic thinking. Underlying this rethinking of the history of eugenics is an argument that resistance to white supremacy necessitated scientific and medical considerations as part of a multifaceted approach to racial justice. The urgency of addressing unrelenting racism led African Americans to embrace eugenic thinking and consider if insurgent and progressive uses of eugenics were possible and to what extent. And so for my talk today, I want to focus on, I want to sort of center on the ways that African Americans reinterpreted, engaged, and critiqued eugenics to demonstrate the sort of range of Black eugenic thought. I will focus on two sites of discourse for today. First, I'm going to begin with the work of Black physicians, and then I'm going to move to the ways that eugenics is discussed in the Black press. Together, these two areas of Black eugenic thought demonstrate the broad and varied ways in which African Americans understood the utility of eugenics for advocating for racial equality. So starting with physicians, African American physicians faced significant challenges in the early 20th century. The development of Black medical schools created significant opportunities for medical training, but this expansion was quickly eroded by the impact of the Flexner Report in 1910. With only 2 Black medical schools remaining, Howard and Meharry, African Americans had very limited access to medical training in the US and often went abroad as a result. African American physicians also faced segregation in other areas at medical schools, but also in residency programs and in employment in medical institutions. They were also excluded from membership from the American Medical Association, which led to the creation of the National Medical Association, the NMA, in 1895, and its journal in 1907. The Journal of the National Medical Association, the JNMA, became the premier site of Black medical discourse for the first half of the 20th century. The journal helped to promote visions of a unified Black medical profession that advocated for both higher medical standards and for racial equality. And it also celebrated the accomplishments of African American physicians. Dr. John A. Kenney, who I'm going to return to later in the presentation, was the first secretary of the NMA and associate editor of the journal. He argued that the very existence of a Black medical journal had showed how far the race had progressed. Quote, "We are publishing a medical journal. Think of it, a race just 40 years removed from slavery, publishing a medical journal." The JNMA became an important site for African American physicians to discuss eugenics and racial science, and to sort of think about what eugenic interventions might look like for the race. Like other American physicians in the early 20th century, African American physicians saw that there was an important relationship between eugenics and medicine. For example, Dr. Preston A. Edwards argued in his NMA presidential address in 1923 that the goals of medicine were, quote, "the preservation of life and the prevention of disease," end quote. He asserted that physicians and scientists needed to transform medicine from a, quote, "progressive art to a fixed science," and emphasized that, quote, "preventive medicine is in the ascendancy, marching boldly on to eugenics and the Superman via birth control." His comments echoed arguments that made by Charles Davenport, but also from physicians like Dr. Harvey Ernest Jordan of UVA and Dr. Lewis Barker of Johns Hopkins Medicine, who also saw eugenics and medicine as working hand in hand towards the goals of human improvement. In the JNMA, African-American physicians discuss the importance of eugenics for racial improvement, as well as how to mobilize birth control and sterilization as eugenic interventions. Eugenics also framed the ways that African-American physicians interpreted questions of racial susceptibility and how they discussed whether high rates of disease, morbidity, and mortality were innate qualities of the race or if they were the result of environmental conditions. It is important to note here that many of the physicians writing in the JNMA in this period would have argued for the existence of biological racial categories. However, for them, the existence of those categories does not necessitate the existence of racism. And it did not mean, nor did it mean that characteristics deemed problematic or dysgenic could not be addressed with different eugenic interventions. Though this is different from our own sort of conceptions, current conceptions of racial categories, the African-American physicians here and other African-American physicians, scientists, social scientists elsewhere in the project sort of disentangle the idea of race from the problem of racism. And in this way, they sort of question, questions of racial susceptibility to disease and other forms of eugenic unfitness can be improved by addressing sort of the biological composition and quality of the race. One physician and prominent figure in the NMA who has been an important part of my work is William Montague Cobb. He was a physician, anatomist, and physical anthropologist at Howard University. He completed his MD at Howard University and then a PhD in physical anthropology at Case Western Reserve under T. Wingate Todd in 1932. Over the course of a distinguished career, he held leadership positions in numerous organizations, such as being president of the National Medical Association in 1964. He also, from 1957 to 1968, served on the board of the American Eugenic Society. Cobb spent much of his career being invested in biological visions of race while also refuting scientific racism in its various forms. As a physical anthropologist and anatomist, Cobb was deeply invested in what he described as racial anatomy. After completing his PhD and returning to Howard, Cobb modeled his laboratory and anatomical collection after the Heyman-Todd collection at Case Western Reserve. He saw it as a valuable model for Howard because because of, quote, the size and extent of its collection of American Negro material and the unbiased attitude which publications based on that material has revealed, end quote. Cobb's collection would ultimately include anatomical records of 987 individuals and approximately 700 skeletons that represented populations in Washington, D.C. and other Eastern urban areas. He published his first book, The Laboratory of Anatomy and Physical Anthropology at Howard University in 1932, about the development of his laboratory and his vision for the importance of anatomical practice. So this is an image of students working in the laboratory with anatomical material and on each other. In a section of the book entitled Racial Anatomy, Cobb critiqued what he called the, quote, eugenical propaganda, end quote, of Charles Davenport, but didn't really sort of completely relinquish its hereditarian thinking. He argued that, quote, the building of better bodies by thorough conservation and cultivation of each individual's constitutional heritage is universally acknowledged as an ethically sound and practicable procedure, end quote. He instead argued that improving environmental conditions and, quote, child nurture was the most, quote, the most practicable biological approach to the task of human betterment, end quote. To highlight this point, he referenced an unspecified address given by Davenport that argued for the importance of reproductive control, particularly among the lower classes, as essential to human betterment. He believed that Davenport's approach was insufficient because, quote, people still seem to marry whom they will, and eugenical propaganda is so dangerously liable to react unfavorably to minority groups that this approach is best left alone, end quote. In a 1939 article for the American Journal of Negro Education entitled The Negro as a Biological Element in the American Population, Cobb argued that the composition and characteristics of the race could be located in both its history and its biology. He began with what he described as essential facts about the Negro that he considered to be common knowledge. He argued that the American Negro was fecund, physically strong, and mentally able. He added that the American Negro, quote, possessed special aptitudes exemplified by an acute perception of pitch and rhythm, which in association with other factors has resulted in the spirituals and jazz. While he asserted that these essential facts were basically biological characteristics of African Americans, he did not think that they were the only variables in determining the capacity of the American Negro. Instead, he asserted that the future of the American Negro would, quote, appear to rest upon other factors than his biological quality and rely on the promotion of health, hygiene, and education. In a section of the article entitled Physical Constitution, Cobb argued that all of the viscera of the American Negro were the same as other races, with the exception of the spleen, which was smaller. He didn't explain why the spleen was smaller. He just left it there. He added that beliefs around limited lung capacity and flat feet were, quote, difficultly reconcilable, end quote, with African Americans' known fleetness and endurance. Cobb also argued that the American Negro's ability to survive oppression was evidence of a strong physical constitution. Quote, not only the conditions surrounding his arrival, but those under which the Negro has lived in America must have had a selective effect on approving his stock. Pre-emancipation exploitation must be credited with a mass elimination, not alone of the weak and unfit, but also of those who were lacking in that individual shrewdness, which is a vital essential in self-preservation. He essentially argued that the Middle Passage and slavery and systematic oppression had had a eugenic effect on the race by actually improving its biological composition and makeup. Cobb asserted that slavery and its aftermath created the Negro into, quote, the most highly selected stock in America, end quote, because, quote, no other group of Americans in such large numbers has had to pass such rigorous tests of survival fitness as has the American Negro, end quote. And while this might be a bit maybe jarring to our sensibilities, Cobb's assertions demonstrated how he understood the sort of impact of heredity and eugenics on the development of biological racial categories. Switching gears here, I want to return to John A. Kenney, who was a founding member of the NMA and associate editor of its journal. Kenney was the son of formerly enslaved people, and he joined the staff of the Tuskegee Institute in 1902 and served as the personal physician to Booker T. Washington and to George Washington Carver. He also served as the director of the John A. Andrew Hospital that was affiliated with Tuskegee. One of Kenney's one of the things that he was deeply concerned about was the prevalence of syphilis among Southern African American populations. According to African American sociologist Charles Johnson's 1934 study, Shadow of the Plantation, 30% of African Americans in Macon County, Alabama, tested positive for syphilis that year. And I mention this not only because it's the location of the John A. Andrew Hospital and the Tuskegee Institute where Kenney works, but it's also the primary site of the Tuskegee syphilis study, right, which is also ongoing with his career. Kenney was concerned that these significant rates of syphilis morbidity would be damaging to the composition of the race, but also that these and other data would be used to make arguments for African American inferiority. In an address to the teachers at the Tuskegee Institute Summer School that was published in the JNMA, he argued that, quote, social diseases like syphilis were the primary cause of what he described as racial decay, and asserted that these diseases, quote, that these are the diseases which are so frequently responsible for our feeble-minded, blind, weaklings, and degenerates, end quote. For him, eugenic marriage laws, reproductive control, and strong moral values could address the spread of social diseases because, quote, eugenics would prevent any condition which means racial deterioration, end quote. He saw high rates of syphilis as evidence of a lack of morals rather than as a sort of evidence of biological racial susceptibility. He implored young women in the audience to avoid having children, quote, by accident rather than by design, end quote, and to stay away from vices that contributed to high rates of syphilis, such as the most recent dance craze. He didn't say what the craze was, he just called it the dance craze, which he said was not in accord with the eugenic idea. In 1910, Kenney published a scathing editorial in the JNMA that was a response to an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association by a white physician named Thomas Merle. Merle's article had argued that high syphilis morbidity among African Americans was due to racial susceptibility, sexual depravity, and an inability to comply with treatment. Kenny strongly disagreed with Merle's conclusions, and at the end of the editorial, he asked his readers, quote, "Has there ever been an article more filled with the wholesale condemnation of the morals of all classes of the race? And what is most unfair is his attempt to condemn even our refined classes, along with the slum product among whom he has undoubtedly had large experience," end quote. Though Kenny refuted Merle's assumptions about the morality and quality of the race, he differentiated which of its members deserved critique. For Kenny, all classes of African Americans were not the problem. Only the unfit members, the slum product, were worthy of such criticism. Middle and upper class African Americans like himself were both biologically and morally uplifted, and they believed that they had a responsibility to uplift the slum product, meaning the unfit members of the race, which reflected the sort of broader class politics of racial uplift ideology. Even though his analysis here resembled some of the views and claims that some of his white eugenicist contemporaries would make in the same moment, his argument shows that some of the sort of different valences of Black eugenics, rather than making claims about the sort of susceptibility of the entire racial groups, or thinking in terms of innate racial characteristics, Kenny here is reinforcing the idea that syphilis prevalence is a problem of morality rather than a problem of biology. However, as he discussed in the address that I just mentioned, this problem of morality could be addressed with eugenic interventions like eugenic marriage and targeted reproduction. African American physicians embraced reproductive control in different forms, and birth control especially, as ways to improve the biological composition of the race by emphasizing the importance of good health, for quality reproduction, which was deeply shaped by eugenic conceptions of better breeding. This led some African American physicians to embrace the American birth control movement because they saw Margaret Sanger's vision of birth control as part of how they imagined the possibilities of racial improvement. Sanger was also interested in collaborating with African American leaders to develop birth control clinics in African American communities. In June 1932, the Birth Control Review, which was the periodical of the American Birth Control League, Sanger's organization, published a special issue about African Americans and birth control entitled A Negro Number. A Negro Number was a who's who of African American leadership. For example, you see W.E.B. Du Bois's article at the top, Black Folks and Birth Control, that Du Bois concluded with the statement that, quote, "They must learn that among human races and groups, as among vegetables, quality and not mere quantity really counts," end quote. A Negro Number also included pieces from two African American physicians that were both active in the NMA. One of them, Midian O. Bousfield, who I'm not going to get to in this talk, but happy to answer questions about. But the other is W.G. Alexander, who was General Secretary of the NMA, and he contributed a piece entitled A Medical Viewpoint, where he argued that birth control was essential for improving different areas of African American life. Alexander believed that having too many children, especially just for the sake of having them, would negatively impact the health of women and their offspring. He stated, quote, "The economic betterment of the Negro, the health betterment of the Negro, and the betterment of community standards, which is an inevitable corollary, demand a policy and a program that will at least modify his present unfavorable situation. Birth control offers the only reasonable solution." In the same year of A Negro Number, Alexander published a different article in the JNMA called Birth Control for the Negro, a Fad or Necessity, where he made a medical, demographic, and moral argument for African American participation and advocacy around birth control. Alexander asserted that African Americans were the stewards of African American health and that it was imperative for them to embrace birth control in this role. Quote, "I have endeavored in this paper to indicate that birth control is a reasonable, a sane, and a safe program and procedure, and that because of the peculiar situation and circumstances of Negro living and Negro life is particularly applicable," to Negroes. And so he saw this, he had this vision of birth control that was essential not only for improving health, but this broader vision of improving the race. African-American engagement with eugenics and birth control was not limited to physicians and scientists or to specialized publications. Rather, African-Americans of varying social strata engage and debate the possibilities of eugenics in the Black press. So Black eugenics discourse was actually much wider than what we see in the JNMA or the Birth Control Review or in other sort of medical and scientific publications. African-American physicians, scientists, and social scientists often engaged and reinterpreted eugenics at the conceptual level, and their discourses reflected a middle-class racial uplift politics in which elite African-Americans saw their responsibility to uplift their poor and eugenically unfit counterparts. The Black press, however, contained more vigorous debate over eugenics that illustrated a broader set of racial uplift politics and often contained much more significant critique of eugenics than the JNMA. An examination of Black newspapers here in my project so far, I've been using the Chicago Defender, the New York Amsterdam News, and the Pittsburgh Courier because they had national circulation. But the sample of articles that I pulled from there show the ways that African Americans not only sort of understood the possibilities of eugenics, but also the ways that they understood eugenics to be weaponized against them. Eugenics had become so deeply embedded in African American life that it actually appears in newspaper filler and in ads and in notices. There were notices for eugenic lectures and sermons, like this fundraising notice for the Chicago Defender in 1913, where Grace Presbyterian Church reported that, quote, Dr. DeHoffy addressed the young people in their meeting from 6 to 7 last Sunday. His subject was eugenics and its effects on the rising generation. So that will be the image on your left. A similar notice from the Hope Presbyterian Church in 1915 reported that, quote, the Alpha Club and the Boy Scouts will turn out in a body to hear an address on eugenics by Dr. W.N. Thomas next Sunday. The public, and especially all men, are cordially invited to these popular lectures by our noted speakers, end quote. There were also moments of eugenic humor in Black newspapers. A short piece entitled Up to Date Eugenics joked about a marriage proposal. Madge, did Charlie ask your father last night? Marjorie, no, he forgot to bring his income tax receipts. Another piece called Cuckoo Eugenics from a column called This, That, and the Other, and the unnamed author argued that, of course it may all be right, but we remember when them clanners and something about the same darn thing if we wish their purpose to be made easy. Wouldn't the Cloxies have a grand time sterilizing the dependent, the delinquent, and the defective of the race? You'd all be dodging, end quote. And though subtle, Cuckoo Eugenics shows some of the tensions within Black eugenics. If properly mobilized, properly and objectively mobilized, eugenics was essential to racial improvement, but tainted with racism, eugenics could lead to the destruction of the race. These kinds of bits and pieces in newspapers show the ways that eugenics and birth control made their ways into different areas of popular culture, and that many people saw their utility in thinking about the problems that face the race, and also challenging whether or not they had utility. Beyond these sort of snippets that appear in the Black press, there are also much more sustained and substantive analysis of the role of eugenics and better breeding in improving African American life. Similar to TEB's article, educator and clubwoman Rebecca Stiles Taylor wrote a column for the Chicago Defender called As a Woman Thinks, where she argued that understanding heredity was crucial for racial improvement. She argued that African Americans did not emphasize the role of heredity enough in addressing what she described as the problem of racial decay. Quote, in our mad race for education, book learning, and our pathetic but insistent struggle for economic stability, we have somewhat overlooked the importance of improving our group in its natural, moral, mental, and physical qualities, its inborn endowment of body and mind. For to do this, we must plan first for the increasing of our well-born, and second for the decreasing of our ill-born. The caps are hers. For Taylor, it was vital to use the knowledge of heredity to cultivate the best qualities in the race and limit the propagation of defective heredity. She then described who she described or who she counted as well-born and ill-born, and argued that the well-born could only be cultivated through eugenic marriage. When African Americans had fully embraced eugenic family planning, she argued sterilization would become unnecessary. Quote, with such an education and elevation of African Americans' taste, she wrote, there will be little need for sterilization, for they will seek their mental, moral, social, and physical equal or superior, and their children will, of a consequence, all things being equal, not swell the ranks of the defectives, end quote. Taylor asserted that if African Americans fully embraced the possibilities of eugenics, they would not need external measures like sterilization to improve the race. Her article largely encouraged African Americans to embrace and internalize eugenics to ensure racial progress rather than to contribute to racial decay. By the 1930s, there's actually a pretty discernible shift in how eugenics and especially compulsory sterilization laws were discussed in the Black press. Even though there had been skepticism and criticism of sterilization in years prior, as the number of sterilization laws increased, so too did African Americans become more concerned that they would be used against the race. For example, a 1935 article in the Chicago Defender calls for the sterilization of the mentally ill in Georgia, linked the expansion of sterilization to other racial problems. Quote, what Georgia needs is not more medicine, but more truth. The growth of feeble-minded children, not alone in Georgia, but in any state, is usually the creature of the tyranny of social customs of their foreparents. Sterilization of body without sterilization of mind will do little good. What Georgia needs is a new state of thinking, end quote. The following year, a piece on the South Carolina sterilization law stated, quote, as it can be imagined, the law only hits the, quote, lower class of people and the oppressed race of people in particular, end quote. Though some African Americans in the same moment understood reproductive control as something that's useful for racial improvement, others become increasingly concerned that these laws would be weaponized against African Americans. These anxieties were exacerbated by events in the US and abroad. So for example, in 1936, the Pittsburgh Courier published an article about do I have this on the wrong, oops. Oh, I'm accidentally missing a slide. It's okay. Published an article about the sterilization of heiress Ann Cooper Hewitt. Hewitt's mother had declared her feeble-minded and then sterilized her in order to take her inheritance. Hewitt sued her mother and the surgeons who performed the procedure, but ultimately lost the case. The article asserted that if it could happen to a wealthy white woman, it would most certainly happen to African Americans and other marginalized groups. The article also argued that even if eugenic sterilization was scientifically valid and effective, people were still too prejudiced to objectively mobilize the practice. Quote, how can we be sure that they are not motivated by base impulses, end quote. There are also two international events that further exacerbated concerns about the weaponization of sterilization laws against African Americans. The first was a proposed sterilization law in Bermuda. In 1935, in a response to high unemployment rates, Bermuda's colonial governor proposed birth control legislation and a compulsory sterilization law for the feeble-minded and for people with illegitimate children. Black Bermudans argued that these laws would unfairly target them, and that proposals were met with such intense protest that they were withdrawn within a few weeks. However, the threat of sterilization laws in Bermuda caused significant outcry in the Black press, and even after the proposed laws were withdrawn. The Pittsburgh Courier reported in 1935 that the proposed laws in Bermuda would target its majority Black population, arguing that it would ultimately, quote, ultimately eliminate the impoverished Negro workers who are kept in such a degraded social condition. Of course, white people would decide who was mentally defective, end quote. Two letters to the editor in the New York Amsterdam News described the proposed laws in Bermuda as a plan for the extermination of the race. Years after the proposed sterilization laws were withdrawn, they continued to receive coverage in the Black press. A 1937 article entitled "Protest Sterilization Threat in Bermuda" in the Pittsburgh Courier on protests from clergy acknowledged that continued discussion of these proposed laws was based on rumors. As late as 1938, the Black press published stories on the threat of sterilization in Bermuda, and one piece even compared the plan to sterilization laws in Nazi Germany. Though the sterilization plan was never actually enacted, the threat of sterilization was enough to galvanize the significant critique and opposition. The second international event that received significant sort of outcry in the Black press was the passage of Nazi sterilization laws and the sterilization of Afro-German children in the Ruhr Valley. Nazi atrocities were frequently invoked in the Black press as a bad omen of what could happen to African Americans in the US. African American journalists made comparisons between eugenic sterilization laws in the US and in Nazi Germany. And it's also important to note here that the Nazi sterilization law is actually based on the California sterilization law. Like if you held them up together, they would look uncomfortably similar. Hitler implemented the Nazi compulsory sterilization program after coming to power in 1933 and targeted those deemed a threat to the racial purity of the Reich. As part of the program, he ordered the sterilization of hundreds of Afro-German children in the Ruhr Valley, which was met with significant outrage in the Black press. The children were the offspring of French colonial troops of African descent who were stationed in the Rhineland after World War I, and the Nazis saw them as a threat to German racial purity. A 1934 article in the Pittsburgh Courier strongly opposed the initial call to sterilize these children and warned that it was a sign of what could happen in the US. Quote, "This is extreme racialism and nationalism gone mad. If there are any Negroes in America disposed to flirt with fascism, they might seriously consider the manner in which German fascists are planning to deal with Negroes. We have already heard some of that talk over here from the Ku Klux Klan, the Anglo-Saxon clubs, the White America Society, and from the intellectual authors of the slogans that these morons live by," end quote. African Americans were not only interested in condemning the oppression of other members of the race, but they also saw the connections between the plight of Afro-Germans and racism in the United States. If eugenics went unchecked in the US, African Americans would share the fate of these Afro-Germans. Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., Baptist minister, and later the first African-American to represent New York in Congress, wrote a scathing piece railing against Nazi policies in 1936. He called Nazi policies, quote, "a reversion to barbarism," end quote, and argued that, quote, "Nazism is definitely committed to persecuting the Black of this world," end quote. Referring to the sterilization of Afro-German children, he argued that, quote, "the mass sterilization in Cologne of Negro children is one of the blackest sins committed in the name of Western culture," end quote. Powell saw this moment as part of larger patterns of racial oppression, both in the US and abroad. And so there's a notable shift in the ways that African Americans use eugenic terms and framing to think about racial improvement because of the disproportionate impact of eugenic interventions on African Americans. Though, as is with the case in the larger American eugenics movement, eugenics doesn't really decline or disappear after the Second World War, but rather sort of migrates into other fields and discourses that continue to shape conversations about race, health, and heredity. African Americans do continue to engage eugenic thought in sort of different permutations, but it does differ significantly from the discourses that we see prior to the Second World War. The anxieties about sterilization and eugenics more broadly that we saw in the Black press turned out actually to be quite prescient. African Americans bore the disproportionate impact of compulsory sterilization laws. Approximately 60,000 people in the United States were subjected to eugenic sterilization. California had the highest of any state at 20,000. My home state, Virginia, came in second place at 8,000. North Carolina's Eugenics Commission sterilized roughly 7,000 people, and around 40% of those people were African American. Even after eugenic sterilization laws begin to be repealed in the 40s and 50s because of the outcry around Nazi atrocities, African Americans, Indigenous people, and Latinx people actually continue to be sterilized against their will and actually in even larger numbers and even larger numbers in the ways that sterilization becomes taken up by sort of the welfare state and public hospitals, et cetera. One example that I often turn to that I think is just very indicative of what this kind of sterilization abuse looks like is the involuntary sterilization of civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer. While undergoing a surgery for a benign uterine tumor, Hamer was subjected to what was called a Mississippi appendectomy, or an involuntary hysterectomy in 1961. She only became aware of the procedure because the operating physician told his wife, who told community members, and eventually the news made its way back to her. Stories like Hamer's helped to shape Black feminist efforts to address sterilization abuse, which become the backbone of reproductive justice movements starting in the 1970s. The increased visibility of sterilization abuse led African Americans to reject the enterprise entirely, rather than reinterpret or reevaluate how it could be used in service of the race. And so to conclude, I argue that Black eugenics as a concept demonstrates the ways that African Americans sought to use science to address social problems that stemmed from structural racism. Black eugenics and its afterlives make visible the long history of African Americans understanding that eugenics had political utility and cultural significance, and that mobilizing these ideas would ultimately become an important part of their advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayah. We're going to open it up for Q&A now. For those of you who are here in person, just feel free to raise your hand. I can call on you, but make sure that you push your microphone so the green light shows up. This is for our guests that are online so that they can hear your question. For those of you who are online, please continue to enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as possible tonight. We do have one question already online from George Amoyth. He says, have you delved into the contents of the medical education for Dr. Cobb at Howard or his earlier education in biology at Case Western, Dr. Kenny Sr. at Shaw University, or other National Medical Association contemporaries who favored eugenics? To what extent were medical schools promoting Darwin's theory of natural selection? To what extent were the eugenicists influencing the selection of medical textbooks in Black medical schools from the mid-19th to early 20th centuries?
I'm just writing this down.
Yeah, I can repeat if you need me to.
Oh, so there's a lot there. So this is a really interesting point, and this is something that I'm still sort of getting my arms around. But in a lot of American medical education, eugenics is firmly baked in, right? That not only through eugenics textbooks that are produced by like the Eugenics Record Office and Charles Davenport, but also through the literature that's proliferating medical journals. And you have really prominent physicians like Lewis Barker at Hopkins or Harvey Ernest Jordan at UVA, who are sort of very vocally arguing that eugenics needed to be actually a central part of medical education. And so Black physicians are certainly a part of this world where eugenics is sort of accepted as an important sort of scientific and medical discipline that can be mobilized to deal with lots of different issues. And in some cases with some of the physicians that I look at, you can sort of see the paper trail of who they're reading, who they're in correspondence with. Cobb is, for example, corresponding with Hopkins eugenicist Raymond Pearl quite a bit. They send each other articles, and they have this very robust correspondence. He also corresponds with physical anthropologist Alice Herdlichka, who's at the Smithsonian, really important physical anthropologist and really invested in anthropometry. Cobb actually goes to take a class from him in anthropometry at the Smithsonian. So when I sort of mention that African Americans are deeply embedded in the movement, it's not only sort of in sites like in the classroom, but it's also because all of this, a lot of the literature that's coming out in this moment that people are reading is deeply embedded with eugenics. And then also you have physicians at Black university, at sort of these Black medical college and other institutions who are receiving literature from eugenics organizations to promote eugenics. You also have Black faculty assigning eugenics text at Howard University. There's a colleague, Bridget Robinson, who's been looking specifically at eugenics education in HBCUs, and I think her book is forthcoming because I want to cite it, so I hope so. But there's a lot of this because it's sort of baked into American medical education, and so there's not a sort of separate track that Black physicians are taking, but they are sort of instead taking that information and trying to mobilize it in a different direction.
Thank you, Ayah. I learned so much here. I really appreciate your talk. Can you say something a little bit more about the relationship between Black eugenicists and Margaret Sanger, especially after that 1939 comment that she made and what they thought? I mean, you mentioned that there was a shift in the 30s, so I'm just wondering if it had anything to do with that or.
Sure. So even despite that comment, I still see after the Second World War, like birth control kind of becomes was one of the things that actually stays pretty consistent. So there are Black folks who are advocating for birth control and family planning. Dr. Dorothy Farabee, who's also at Howard, pushes it, actually is sort of instrumental in having the National Council of Negro Women pass a resolution on birth control, so that there's this idea that birth control and family planning as a sort of voluntary act is still useful, and that what becomes the problem is the sort of compulsory ways that things are disproportionately applied to Black people. So there's still a lot of, there's also a lot of birth control advocacy as part of National Negro Health Week. Planned Parenthood provides lots of material as part of National Negro Health Week to be sent out to Black communities hosting their own observances. So there's still a lot of energy for birth control, and that actually shifts a little bit in the 60s and 70s, where you have Black power movements arguing that birth control is a form of genocide against Black communities. And that's where a lot of the conversation begins to shift, because it becomes conflated in a lot of ways with the sterilization abuse that's occurring in public hospitals in the same moment, and is wrapped up in the sort of implication and sort of the ways that the welfare state operates. So having sterilization and birth control be conditions of receiving welfare, for example, and that becomes conflated with, for example, organizations like Planned Parenthood, when actually it's a bit of a different trajectory. But that's where we start to see the sea changes with a sort of Black radical politics in the 60s and 70s. But even still, there's still support for the idea that like family planning is a useful thing in its different iterations, even though there is this messy history of the ways that that these things are disproportionately targeted at Black communities because of things like population control and things like that. But there's still, alongside that, an interest that there's types of family planning and birth control that are useful, and there are types that are problematic.
Hi, yes, I agree that this was a great talk from Ayah. We went to PhD school together, so it's nice to see her spread her wings. I noticed when you put up the images of the newspapers that you said, oh, it made its way into like filler content, that both of them were, both talks or books about eugenics were targeted toward young people and Boy Scouts. And I was just wondering if discussions of eugenics targeted toward young people were like tailored in any way to that demographic, or seem different?
That's a good question. There is some of this that's targeting Black youth in like National Negro Health Week materials, some of which are deliberately targeted at children, especially in schools. But a lot of the things that I've seen that are specifically about children kind of come in this form, like this lecture at church, this kind of this like sort of extracurricular programming, even though there is some literature that would indicate that like eugenics is being taught in, for example, in public education. But I haven't done enough research to know what that looks like, you know, under the atmosphere of segregation. Would a sort of Black child in a segregated elementary school get the same kind of access to eugenics in a way that that white children might? I haven't done the digging necessary to make that claim, but I imagine that if we're seeing this for K through 12 education in white schools, I imagine there's something comparable that's happening with Black children, but I don't have enough evidence for that yet.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was amazing. I do have a question. So with the rise of Black eugenic thought, did white eugenicists see this as a threat? And also, or were they able to yield it in a way to carry out their own agendas of surveilling communities of color, especially like the African-American community population?
Oh, this is a great question. So far, I haven't seen anything where they feel threatened. And in some instances, I see this like active engagement where you have, so for example, like I was, did research in the archives at Caltech last year, and the Human Betterment Foundation, which is a eugenics organization sort of based on the West Coast, I went through basically, before listservs or listserv, their mailing list, and there's loads of Black schools and Black professors that they're trying to send this material to because they want to get the message out. And so if Black people are willing to listen, they're willing to share it. Just like you have these really interesting and sometimes surprising correspondences between these literally like almost like comic supervillain level racist people and like these Black eugenicists just sort of swapping ideas and sharing articles. Where sometimes you come across and I'm like, why would you, because this person is an arch racist. Yeah. Why are you corresponding with them? But it's because that there's this sort of way that they think by sharing, like by swapping notes, that there's some, broader good that comes out of it. And so I'd be curious. I'm gonna have to do some more digging because I haven't seen anything where they're threatened, but there is moments where they're trying to get Black people to embrace eugenics because they want to target Black people with eugenics, but also because some of them see Black people as sort of comrades in arms to sort of put forward these eugenic ideas out into the world and sort of imagine that we're doing it over here. If you can get these folks to embrace eugenics, then we can get rid of all the unfit people. And how great would that be? Yeah. Right. And so it's a bit of a mixed bag, but there is this sort of really interesting correspondence, engagement. You have Black people going to eugenics conferences. Booker T. Washington used to hang out with like John Harvey Kellogg at Battle Creek. There's all of this, and it's almost strange. Like when I first came across it, I'm like, why would you sign up for this? Yeah. But there's this way that they imagine there's something useful out of it, and that white eugenicists hope that Black eugenicists sort of take on these ideas, but they have different visions for what taking on the ideas might mean.
We have a question from online from Dale Miller, who asks, how did other contemporary Black leaders in the early 20th century respond to eugenics and eugenic policies? For example, did you find opposition to eugenic policies and or situating the race betterment, quote, issues with social determinants?
So I don't, so far, outside of some of these critiques in newspapers, I don't have a lot of Black leaders who openly just completely reject the entirety of eugenics as an enterprise. I do have a lot of Black authors who will try to nuance the claims of eugenics or express the limitations of eugenics or sort of reinterpret who should be the targets of eugenics. But I haven't come across any Black leaders so far who say eugenics is useless, we don't need it, right? Like when that slide I had of the birth control review, like these are some of the most important Black intellectuals of the period. And they're like, nah, this is great. Like, let's do more. And it's strikingly interesting that a lot of that critique is happening in the Black press and it's not happening a lot in these elite discourses. There is, complications and tensions and nuances with eugenics, but I haven't seen any overt rejection yet, which is honestly on course, because that's sort of the case with the broader American eugenics movement, that a lot of people sort of think conceptually eugenics is a good idea and differ in what the implication or what the application of eugenics might look like. So you have people who argue like, yes, we should use heredity to, resolve social problems. And wouldn't it be great, instead of having poverty and crime, if we could just prevent these things from existing with eugenics? And a lot of people get on board with this. Where you have a lot of differences is how people would like to implement eugenics. So you have people who think eugenics is a great idea, but have a problem with compulsory sterilization laws, but think that voluntary birth control is a great idea, for example.
So Dr. Nuriddin, thank you so much for this incredible talk tonight. It's been a pleasure
questions.
having you here. For everyone else, please join us on March 19th for our next lecture with Dr. Jeremy Brown, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming.